Hi there. Thank you for tuning into this segment on web archiving as a tool for both the preservation of and developmental testing of online content. I want to start with a little personal introduction to provide some context and disclaimers about my perspectives on this topic. My name is Jasmine Mulliken. I have a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, which I received in 2011. And I started my digital humanities career, as many of us did or are currently doing, in a graduate program that was at its foundation somewhat traditional, but enhanced by a growing focus on digital studies. My PhD is formally in English, but my emphasis is in a concentration known as digital literacies and literatures. So during my grad program, I worked in the digital writing and research lab instead of in the writing center, and I took classes in accessibility and the virtual body and computers and writing. At the same time, I was studying Joyce and Beckett and archival and textual research in the Harry Ransom Center. My dissertation on Joyce included a digital appendix, but was otherwise pretty traditional in that I wrote about reading and studying Joyce through a multimodal lens rather than demonstrating those concepts. A digital appendix allowed me to illustrate some of what I was arguing, but ultimately the dissertation called for a more traditional linear textual approach. After graduating in 2011, finally free, or so I naively thought, of the yoke of tradition, I rebelliously decided that instead of turning the more traditional body of my dissertation into my first monograph publication, I would pursue the much funner route of expanding on the appendix and developing out what I first wireframed as a teaching tool into a full-blown digital humanities research project. So the Mapping Dubliners project became my main scholarly focus. And after initially setting up the map, I would add weekly essays analyzing a different point on the map in terms of its historical and political significance and what it meant that Joyce mentioned it in his text. This choice had some heavy consequences. 5 years after graduating with my PhD, I had written nearly 90 essays for my project, but I was still working as a visiting assistant professor at a research university, seeing positions I could have filled given to scholars with book projects, either published or in the process of being shaped out of dissertations. Because the truth was, and still very much is, a digital project, no matter how many words it contains or how novel the argument it presents, is still not a book. There are a lot of factors contributing to the perceived legitimacy or lack thereof with digital projects. What constitutes scholarship is one jumping off point. Another is that they are difficult to cite when URLs are as changing as the technologies that serve them. And the fact that they are centralized rather than distributed means that lots of copies are not automatically being collected by the stewards we rely on to preserve our printed texts and ephemera. But the factor I want to focus on in this particular presentation is that of longevity. Because for many traditional peer reviewers, and for tenure review committees and for future researchers, a big concern about digital scholarship is its ephemerality, especially when it comes to web projects. We've all surely heard the generalization that web content typically has a lifespan of 3 to 5 years. Books, on the other hand, if they're treated right, can last millennia or more. Obviously, the rapidly changing framework of the web as a presentation platform means that content written for a particular server and browser configuration will become outdated when those supporting dependencies update. What seems to be standardized one day changes a few years or months later, and anything at all innovative in its presentation is guaranteed at some point to become aesthetically, if not technically, outdated. So in terms of the scholarly record and the permanence that name implies, web-based digital projects pose a huge challenge. My own project, for example, used WordPress and Google Maps and Earth. And while WordPress is open source, Google Maps and Earth are proprietary. The data may be mine, but it sits on a server out of my control and is tied to an interface that brings a lot of unnecessary bulk to what should be a clean and simple presentation. And there were all kinds of circumstances surrounding my technology choices at the time, and we won't get into that now, but suffice it to say, I am now much more aware of the implications of those choices, and it's in part because of what happened next. After 5 years on the tenure-track job market, teaching comp and lit surveys, and managing to continue building out my project week by week, I came across a completely different professional opportunity. I now work at Stanford University Press, managing the production side of the publishing process, specifically for the press's web-based digital projects. These are projects we're publishing under a Mellon-funded program that began in 2015. If you're not familiar with the program, I definitely encourage you to check it out at supdigital.org. But to put it very simply, it's a publishing program that focuses solely on digital web-based scholarship. These projects have all the heft and rigor of traditional scholarly monographs, but use completely digital means of expressing their arguments. There is no print corollary for these projects. In fact, the arguments depend on the interactive potential of the digital medium. They foreground multimedia and non- or multilinear navigation through the content. So essentially, I'm now working to ensure the kind of work I was doing gets recognized as a legitimate piece of the scholarly record. And based on my own project and the 7 other projects I've now helped produce and publish, I know the challenges facing the longevity of those pieces, and I have made it part of my work now to ensure what we do publish remains in that record as long as any book will. So over the past 4.5 years I've now been at SUP, I've identified a few different ways to mitigate this longevity issue, and I want to share a little more about how you can use some of the tools we've researched and adopted at the press to start thinking about the longevity of your own work. Because even without the underwriting of a university press, the presentation of digital humanities research in online web-based formats constitutes a kind of publication, which in itself implies a certain level of fixity or completion. Even if the online content is meant to evolve through updates, annotation, or discussion, the act of putting a base level package on the web for dissemination entails bringing that content to a preliminary state of fixity. To arrive at even this preliminary fixity involves certain decisions about delivery, decisions that can affect a project's ultimate longevity on the web. For instance, what platform will be used. Scalar, Wordpress, Drupal, and other content management systems necessitate constant maintenance through updates of the platform, plugins, and themes. While CMSs and even custom PHP-based applications provide ease of updating or adding new content, they're unnecessarily heavy for sites that are only meant to be updated for editorial purposes and those that are meant to just display finished work. In such cases, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript packages are always best. Even still, JavaScript libraries change as browsers evolve, and even the most minimal sites can need basic maintenance over the years. So, how can scholars ensure the web-based work they are producing will survive the constant changes to the medium delivering their message? Well, one solution that is becoming more user-friendly is web archiving. Services like Archive-It and tools like Web Recorder, Conifer, and other open source web archiving software can be used to crawl and repackage web content so that it can be displayed, navigated, and interacted with in the same way as it could on the day it was captured. So here's an example. At SUP, we are creating web archives of all our digital publications so that when a live web project starts breaking, we can roll over to an archived version. And here I'm showing a live version of Filming Revolution by Elisa Lebo. And here is the web archived version. As you can see, it looks indistinguishable on the surface. What's happening under the hood, though, is a complete migration of format that, through a harvest, packages up all the code, content, and media assets and converts it into what's called a work file. This file is then read by a work player to output an interactive copy of the original website's user experience. And you've seen a web archive if you've ever perused the Wayback Machine. But whereas the Wayback Machine is typically used a bit more as a collection of what already exists or what used to exist or how a site looked on a certain date, tools like Archive-It, Web Recorder, and Conifer can be used to purposefully capture and curate content, which makes them particularly useful to content creators who want to get ahead of their own project's obsolescence. And I should say that Wayback has started offering the option as well to capture an existing web page if it doesn't already exist in their collection. But even this approach puts control of the crawl into outside hands. you may find that the capture or replay isn't faithful to the original content, as seen here. And the reason for this is that, first of all, not all web archiving tools are the same. Second, massive crawlers like the ones used by Wayback are good at capturing a thin layer with great frequency, but the trade-off is a lack of depth. For instance, the capture may only go a few links deep so that when you get a few clicks in, you start meeting with errors. Another issue is that different crawlers and replay frameworks handle JavaScript differently. So the more complex the script, the harder it is to replicate in the work format. And that's what's actually happening here. So that's why controlling your own crawl can be super useful. When you do the crawl, you ensure all the pieces are captured, and you determine the depth of capture, and you can QA test the results. That said, though, web archiving isn't easy. Some tools are more user-friendly for entry-level users, while others that require command line familiarity can allow for more granular configuration, but are harder to use. Individual content creators or casual users might want to start with Rhizome's Conifer, a browser-based crawling, curating, patching, and replay tool. Conifer is actually built on the web recorder technology, and the entire open source web recorder suite of tools is also pretty user-friendly, offering a browser extension even, so you can actually crawl as you browse. It also offers a desktop application with a graphic user interface that's intuitive and really made for everyone. Content creators can use these tools at any time for free, even during development, to test what an archived version of their site will look like. Based on the results, you may be able to track down assets you didn't realize were being sourced externally, or links to external content that you may want to archive, even for use in the live site. So in other words, you can link to a web archived version of an externally hosted page instead of live linking to it to ensure that that linked content remains intact in the context of your own project, even if the URL or the original source changes in the next few months or even days. So these user-friendly tools are perfect for keeping archiving considerations at the forefront during development. But I should also note that these tools do have their limitations. Just because something doesn't show up in a web archive doesn't always mean you're doing something wrong in development. In fact, finding inconsistencies between a live and archived website or page, again, opens up opportunities for conversation between creators and preservationists to pinpoint how not only a web project can be developed more sustainably, but also how archiving tools can be improved to meet the challenges of constantly changing content development technologies. So on a more advanced level, tools like Archive-It and open source command line archiving tools like Browsler, Heritrix, and Squidwork are options for preservationists and institutional archiving programs. Archive-It is, for example, a larger scale service that an institution would subscribe to. So if you're a content developer, you would want to reach out to your center or library to see if they have a subscription and if you can work with someone to capture your work. And on the other hand, if you work in a library or DH center, it's an investment in your institution's research outputs to build out a web archiving program with dedicated specialists who can work with students and faculty and emphasize the importance of archiving at early stages, train them when appropriate, and collaborate with them on final results to create web archives of finished work or even versions of web-based projects as they evolved. In fact, mapping progress of a web project's development can be in itself a powerful use of web archiving and another reason to get into web archiving early in the development process. While web archiving offers an end solution for archiving web content, then it can also be used during production to test a project's web archivability. If all of this seems daunting, I just want to say that the last several years I've spent getting to know web archiving and its community has been not just enlightening, but actually a lot of fun. The people developing, supporting, and working to make web archiving equitable and sustainable are people I would love to see involved in forums like DHSI. As a pretty basic web archiving practitioner myself, and coming from the perspective of a content developer rather than a trained archivist, I can't get too technical about the infrastructure and the tools, but I can say that there are web archiving resources that are becoming more and more geared for everyday archivists and content creators and publishers. The IIPC is one organization that holds an annual conference and is has a very active community year-round. You can find them online at netpreserve.org and on Slack. It's iipc.slack.com. And I'll also take a moment here to especially plug this series, curated by Anna Perici, a leading figure in web archiving. Each session in this recorded series is focused on a different aspect of web archiving, from tools to ethics to just getting started. And I highly recommend it as a jumping off point. Specific tools like Web Recorder also offer some community engagement through blog posts and open monthly calls to discuss needs and new features. I'll end with this final thought. One of the most powerful outcomes of even thinking about web archiving during the development stages of your project is that it guarantees you'll initiate important collaborations early with those who will be stewarding your work in the long term. By inquiring about what archiving tools and practices are in place, or by requesting certain tools be added to the infrastructure, you're putting yourself into a conversation that too often gets pushed to the end, to a point even that's too late. Engaging with the folks who will be there at your project's end and bringing them in as collaborators at the beginning is an investment in the lifespan of your project. Forming these collaborations early will initiate the conversations that will ensure your project is still around when you begin applying for tenure-track jobs or when you're up for tenure and need that work to be available to reviewers. And if you're on the other side of that collaboration and are yourself someone working with faculty and students on their web-based projects, you have the opportunity to learn about the technologies they're using and, even better, potentially inform those technology decisions to ensure what's being created is something that will last, given the tools you have to support archiving and maintenance. There are different ways to go about preservation of digital work, but for web-based content, really the most straightforward and cost-effective approach for a high-fidelity, parallel user experience at least, is web archiving. But most importantly, embedding some kind of a preservation plan and testing it early on in a project's development is the most effective way to ensure you're involving the collaborators who will be essential to a project's lifespan. Thank you again for tuning in, and I'm happy to answer any questions via Twitter or email.